Next order of business is roll call members. Please indicate your presence when the machine is open. If all the members voted, Tyler, roll.
Hey, it's Blake and Earl here for another episode of Sessions, and I'm actually going to jump right in. Not a lot of small talk today. If you're watching the news, a lot is going on, a lot of discouraging things, a lot of upsetting things. And so today, to talk about all of that, we are joined by the inestimable Matthew Delano Roosevelt Pierce, who's here to join us to talk about redistricting reform, not just redistricting reform, actually just redistricting in the most craven, awful, political loyalty to one person approach that I think any of us have ever seen. So Matt, thanks for being a part of this today.
You're welcome.
Hey, can we just start with what has happened? So we can start like Texas, right? President Trump asks Texas to pick up 5 more seats for Congress. What has happened since that moment, Matt? Can you kind of just walk our listeners through the sea of delusion that has transpired since then?
Well, the first thing that has to be said is, folks, this is not normal. I mean, this is crazy stuff. This isn't your average everyday politics kind of stuff. So, yeah, Trump apparently sees the ship going down in the midterms, and he's probably going to have a House of Representatives that might actually believe in oversight and investigation. And, you know, it would be like a new world for him. So he wants to desperately avoid any accountability. So, you know, he calls up Texas, hey, redraw your district in the middle of the decade and get me 5 more seats, right? Which is, you know, about what they think the switch would be to get the Democrats in control. But that ends up getting a little bit bumpy. The Democrats leave for a while because they can break the quorum there, deny the quorum. And at that point, California shows up and says, well, if you're going to play that way, we're not going to stand by and let you do that. So we're going to, you know, redo ours and basically cancel out your 5. So now I think what happened at that point is all the White House operative types looked around and they said, well, we kind of got neutralized by California. So what can we do? Well, let's just go to every red state that's got a supermajority and see if we can squeeze just 1 more seat, maybe 2 more seats out of each of these states. And, you know, if we get 3 or 4 of them to go along with it and do it, you know, we've kind of added a whole nother Texas worth of seats to us. So I think that's what's going on. And one of the first places apparently they thought was ripe for the pickings was here in good old Indiana, because the Republicans got a supermajority, got a Republican governor. And if he can convince them to act, then they magically have 1 more seat, at least, maybe 2. We can talk about whether it's even rational to think you could squeeze, you know, 2 more Republican seats out and make it a complete sweep. But there's talk about that.
And so as of the recording today, it's Friday, August 29th that we're recording. So, I mean, things are happening kind of fast too, right? They could announce a special session over the long holiday weekend, you know. So what we do know has happened, though, is a group of our Republican colleagues went out to, at the invitation of the president, to the White House to be courted even further. So we've all seen pictures now. We know who is there. What's everybody's take on this piece of the puzzle?
Well, to me, it's kind of the whole deal because, you know, my sense is the Republicans in Indiana know this is wrong, and all but the most partisan Republicans don't really want to do it. They don't want to go down that path. But as we've seen with every Republican in the United States of America, if Donald Trump threatens them, they cave. You know, they fold like a cheap suit. So we're kind of in this waiting period where we expect them to cave and go ahead and have the governor announce a special session, and then they're going to do the dirty deed. But I don't know for sure that's going to happen. I'm holding out this little kernel of hope that maybe the leaders of the legislature and the governor will look in the mirror and say, well, when I'm talking to my grandkids 20 years from now, do I want to tell them that I helped subvert democracy, or do I want to tell them that I stood up for principle? We can only hope.
You look at an invitation to the White House normally is this prestigious thing, and it's a yes without even a second thought. You know, we have a state where our 2 senators are Republican, our 9 congressional districts, 7 of them are Republican. The two that are not are Frank Mervan, whom is up here in Northwest Indiana, and Andre Carson in the Indianapolis area where you are, Blake. And I will say this, I find it interesting as we're, all trying to figure out and read the tea leaves. The delegation here in Northwest Indiana, unless I'm mistaken, none of the Republicans went to the White House. In fact, there was a newspaper article where I think all except two responded saying they're not going. So I think going along with what you said, Matt, and I think some other conversations and, people have put out statements, it's clear this is not a universal thing that they want to do. And I think, and I'm going to ask you this question, Matt, I know before the White House thing, people were asking me and I was saying it's probably 50-50. Now that the White House thing has happened, and, I'm sure we weren't in the room where it happened, but I'm sure some pressure was applied. Where do you think we are now, Matt?
Well, who knows what got said in the Oval Office with Trump and Speaker Houston and President Pro Tem Bray. We can only speculate, but if we look at the way Trump has operated in the past, it was probably a little bit of a carrot and stick kind of thing. So it's probably like, hey, you play ball with me, I can do you some favors. You don't play ball with me, I can hurt you. So, maybe key members of the legislature are going to end up being ambassadors to warm climate countries. You never know. So, to me, that probably increases the likelihood that something's going on. That carrot and a stick kind of reward system, I think, is probably in play right now.
You say that, Matt, where someone broke down that no one is fired from the White House, but they become ambassadors somewhere. So you may have a valid point there. And I'll tell you the other thing that I'm, for lack of a better word of using, are afraid of is what kind of things will be potentially taken away from the state of Indiana in terms of funding that comes from the federal level. When you talk about pressure, that's an obvious pressure point that could be used.
Yeah, I've heard rumors about that. Again, everything's happening in a black box. So we kind of have to speculate, but there are a lot of rumors swirling that one of the things they said is like, hey, if you want federal funding, you better play ball. They could certainly put the word out, don't give any grants to Indiana. Whether or not they can mess with things that are, quote, entitlements like Medicaid and figure out a way to blow that money up. But, because these people don't follow any rules, I could see them just saying, like, you're not getting anything. Now, that might be a little too blatant and draw too much attention, but they don't respect any rules. So who knows what they might be threatening behind the scenes.
Along those same lines, Matt, it seems like the question might be for the average listener, right? Like, how is this legal, right? How is it legal they can do this? And so our state constitution would make it impossible for them to do the legislative maps without amending the Constitution. So they couldn't do our maps right now, again, mid-decade. And the only thing that would prevent them from doing it right now is a state law that essentially says it happens on the first regular session after the census. So mechanically, a special session gets called, they repeal that law, and then draw maps. Is that the only way that this becomes legal in the state of Indiana, or would you just say, to hell with that law and you don't even matter?
Well, I'm not sure whether there's any law that actually applies. You're right that in the state constitution, it says for legislative districts, that happens in the year after the decennial census. So that's pretty clear that you can't redraw, state house and state senate districts. But so Blake, did you say you're aware of some?
I read an article today. I thought an article today that indicated that there was a state statute that says the maps would be redrawn on the first regular session. So not Constitution. Ours is Constitution. Right. This would be a state law. And I don't have the actual citation, so I'm going off of the liberal news media. But it seemed reputable in terms of the source.
So you're absolutely right. Even if that statute exists, they can just put a repealer. The first part of the bill can say this law is repealed, and here are the new districts. So yeah, that old statute, because the saying goes that you cannot bind a future General Assembly. The only way you can bind a future General Assembly is you got to get something into the Constitution. And then they would have to amend the Constitution to take it out. And that's a very long process. 2 different elected General Assemblies have to vote to change it. Then it's got to go to a referendum. So that's a multi-year process. Very hard to unwind that. But a statute, they can just have a quick little repealer, or they can say the most, I call it the nuclear bomb of legislating. The most magical 3 words in the Indiana code are notwithstanding any other law. Maybe that's 4 words. I got to learn how to count. But that, notwithstanding any other law, comma, basically means ignore anything else that's in the 36 volumes of the Indiana code and, do the following. Right. And so that would be, so they could either repeal it outright, or they could just say, like, I'll ignore every other law in the book. Just go ahead and do this.
Wow. So let's talk a little bit. Let's go back a little bit here, because I want to make sure people understand, as Democrats, we haven't just been sitting around waiting for things to happen. And I want to focus on a couple of things that you have done, Matt. I know there was a press conference, and I was in attendance at the State House, that you were one of the main speakers. You've also been on television. Talk to us about some of those things to push back. And also, I think for us as Democrats, is really get the word out there so people know what's going on, the reality of what's going on, and why this is happening.
Yeah, to be honest, I think our best opportunity is up front here early, is to try to just apply as much public pressure as possible. First, on the governor, not to call the special session at all. Second, on the speaker and the president pro tem of the Senate. So if it is called, that they don't handle the bill, because they could just say, sorry, we're not going to do it, and adjourn and be done. And if they go along with it, then we got to apply pressure on every single Republican member of the legislature. Because if you think about it, we know they're kind of squirmish. We've had a handful of legislators say, oh, we're not going to go along with this, or we don't want to do it. So if we have 30 Democrats unified against drawing the new maps, you got to find 21 out of 70 Republicans that would be willing to buck their leadership, that just their conscience guides them in a way that says, I just can't go along with it. Now, that's a tall order. They've kind of fallen in line before on other issues, but if maybe they hear from enough people back home, it might make them think twice. They might decide that, I think that maybe I'll take my chances surviving a primary and being able to win the general election. Particularly if, I do think that most Republicans don't like this either. Your average kind of Republican voter across the state. I mean, there's some percentage that are like super partisans, and they're like, anything that gives us a win. So I think if these members heard from enough people in the Republican base saying, like, hey, I like Republicans, I like our agenda, but this is just too much. This is not really fair. This is cheating. Then I think, maybe you can find 21 people that get enough pressure, and you can get up to that 51 number to decisively defeat the bill. Now, that's a tall order, but I think that's really our best shot.
It's interesting to me because I think one of the arguments we keep hearing, and I think Andrew Ireland was on NPR this week, and one of the arguments I think he parroted was, about what's happened in other states. Like, Democrats do this too. They gerrymander. And we're a fair and balanced show here at Sessions.
Yes.
Democrats absolutely have gerrymandered maps in other places around the country. What makes this different, Matt? What makes it different than the typical every 10 years, whoever's in power takes a shot at some more seats?
It's a total misdirection. It's like being kids get caught and they yell at their parents, well, he did it too, right? So absolutely correct. Whichever party has majority control in the states in the year after the census, when these maps are normally drawn, with a few exceptions, they all gerrymander like crazy, right? We have, maybe I think 12 states or something that have some type of nonpartisan system. Everybody else, it's like to the victor go the spoils, right? And in Indiana, we've offered and voted for amendments that would say, let's go to a nonpartisan system. And so that would solve that problem. But that's a complete misdirection because, that's one problem to be dealt with, gerrymandering across the country. This is a complete new thing. To have a president come out and brazenly say, uh-oh, I might lose the Congress in the midterms election. So, hey, Republican states, rig the maps so we get an unfair advantage. And to have states say, okay, Mr. President, sure thing, sounds good to us, and to actually start to do it is the unusual thing. So, Representative Ireland can try to misdirect us on like they do it too kind of thing. I mean, I don't know when the Republicans became such snowflakes. I mean, It's like, oh, those horrible Democrats in Illinois and Maryland, they're gerrymandering us. Oh, they do it even better than us. That's a bunch of BS. They're all champion gerrymanders, these majority parties, right? And this is the most insidious thing in our political system. We would have a much more responsive Congress, a much more responsive legislature if we had nonpartisan redistricting. Because what's happened over the past decades is technology has advanced to a point where you can redraw these maps with precision. And you can give yourself an advantage that lasts almost the entire decade. You know, in 1990, I remember the person who redrew the maps, he used a slide rule. He liked to use a slide rule. We did have a 286 computer in the corner. Like, you would hit the button and say, like, you know, draw this district, and you would come back like an hour later to see if it were done. I mean, that's how primitive the technology was. And those maps tended to wear out. You know, you get to like, you know, the 6th year, you get into those last couple elections and demographic shifts and different changes, the minority party would have an opportunity to pick up some seats and maybe even capture the majority. Now, because of technology, because of all the information we have about each and every voter unique to them that can be sliced and diced and crunched, they can make super precise, very lasting maps. Now, what does that do? It puts people like me in a 70% Democratic district because they cram all the Democrats into one district, right? And then they slice and dice stuff like Marion County. They take these rural districts and they come in and they take a little bite out of the Democrats in Indianapolis. And they have all these bites all around Marion County. And so you end up with the majority of the Republicans and a lot of the Democrats are in these lopsided districts. So what that then means is the only thing that really matters is the primary, right? Because if you're in a 70% district, one way or the other, if you come out of the primary as the nominee, it's highly unlikely that you will be defeated in the general election. So the general election just becomes like a rubber stamp pro forma kind of thing. Back in the day, when we had legislatures where it was like 50-50, 51-49, 52-48, I mean, the biggest majorities that you saw a couple decades ago was like 55-45. And those people were in districts where they knew they could lose. So what they had to make sure is not only that they had their base supporters behind them from their party, but they had to go out and get 10-15% of these independents, these people in the middle. And they had to convince them that they were the best candidate. And that 10 or 15% of independents in the middle, they would like swing back and forth. They would like, are things going well? Do I feel like I'm prospering? Is life good? Okay, maybe I keep the guys in power now, in control. If I'm mad, things aren't getting done, you're not addressing my issues, okay, out you go, I'm going to try somebody new. Now the voters can't do that at all. And what's so insidious about this latest attempt on the part of the president and Republicans, like, let's imagine they're successful. So they've got Texas redrawn. Let's say that they get Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, and they end up with, you know, a 3-person majority out in the U.S. House, right? Everybody's going to know that that was because they cheated. They rigged the districts, right? That means that Congress will have no legitimacy among about half the country. Half the country is going to say, why should I even obey the laws these guys are passing? Because they're illegitimately elected. They cheated. That's a real problem for our country. No matter which party you're in, that's a problem. Our institutions of democracy only function because our people have faith in them. We're willing to, you know, abide by the laws passed. If we believe our courts are, you know, objective and reading the law and being fair in the way they interpret things, we're willing to follow Supreme Court rulings without, you know, having some military guy with a bayonet follow us around and say, follow the order, follow the order. And that stuff is going to go by the wayside if they continue to just erode all these democratic principles.
You know, I find it interesting. You know, we talked about how there were some of the Republicans have come out with messages that they're not in support of. We have a lot that did not go. And I forget, someone had a survey recently, and I don't remember which organization, and there were more Republicans that said they were against this than not. And I can tell you, I had a meeting last week with a business owner here in Northwest Indiana about some other things, and he asked me at the end of the meeting my thoughts, and then shared with me he thinks it's a horrible idea, and he wonders if there'll be backlash. So my question for you, Matt, is we as Democrats don't always message well. Republicans message a lot better than us. What's the messaging we need to put out there so that people truly understand what's wrong with this if we do this, and why? What are those reasons why that this is something in a path we should not go down?
Well, I think the number one is like, winners don't cheat. If you're really popular, if your policies are supported, you shouldn't cheat. And, as much as Democrats in the last redistricting after the last census, we really argued a lot for nonpartisan gerrymandering. And we pointed out a lot, here's how your maps are giving you more political power than you actually deserve. We didn't argue like, oh, yeah, you guys would be in the minority if you just drew a fair map, but it would be more like that 55-45 split I talked about. And at the time, they just said, oh, we're not gerrymandering anything. Look how nice and compact our districts work, and we follow all the geopolitical boundaries. There's no gerrymandering here. You just lose because you're not popular. Get over it, Democrats. People just don't like you. Now, if that's the truth, why do they have to cheat and rig up these districts and go back in the middle of the decade and, draw new districts in all these different states to save themselves? If they're that popular, if President Trump is doing a fantastic job for America, why would he be worrying?
I keep going back to George Washington's farewell address. Like as this has been happening, I'm like constantly reminded by it. And he talked 230 years ago. So Matt, you talk about the precision of technology but at the same time, the ideas that are kind of buried in this awfulness have been around since the inception of the country. And George Washington said when people were trying to make him king, when they were trying to give him a third term and violate all the things they had started to build up, he warned against a spirit of party were the words he used, right? That the spirit of party would breed jealousy and it would be retaliatory. And now 230 years later, we have the most crystal clear example of that transpiring in our day-to-day public and political life. And I'm just kind of astounded that, because if I'm citing George Washington, that's fairly conservative, right? I'm looking way back. How are we missing the plot? Like how is it that we can evade these realities that have been kind of embedded in our country's founding?
There are a couple things that are so shocking about this. It's like the first most shocking thing is that you have a president who just brazenly says, oh, we might lose the midterms. We got to redo the districts, right? Pure political power grab. And the president was perfectly comfortable doing that. There was a time, there have been some power grabs in the past. There have been people kind of have done shady things past in the presidency. But, they wouldn't just come out and say like, oh, I deserve to have all these seats and we're going to do a power grab. They would come up with some kind of policy thing to try like, oh, we found out the last census wasn't really accurate, or, oh, gee, this thing's got to be correct. They'd come up with, and it might happen to help us a little bit, but that's just a side effect of us solving some real, nonpartisan policy thing. And no, it's just brazen total power grab. Then the other thing that I find pretty shocking is, so now these local legislators are responding to this demand for President Trump. And the people who support it, who are kind of out in front of it, what is the bottom line of their argument? The bottom line of their argument is the ends justify the means, right? They say, well, gee, if we have Democrats control the U.S. House, then we won't be able to pass our policies. And then that would be bad. We want Republican policies because we like them best. So in order for us to continue letting our president, pass all his policies, we just have to do this. And that's just an ends justifies the means. Again, they're not saying like, oh, gee, maybe we need to explain our policies a little bit better to the people who don't like them, or maybe we need to actually shift our policies and actually behave more within the norms of democracy. And maybe we can rebuild our base of support, motivate people to get out for us and win these elections in the midterm. They're not thinking in terms of a democratic institution. They're just like, the ends justify the means. Whatever we have to do to preserve our power is fair game. And that's what will ultimately destroy our democracy.
I want to touch on and get some more specific answers from you or comments from you, Matt, on some of the things you touched on and some things we haven't. You as you said, we're doing this because, or potentially doing this because of Donald Trump. We're not doing this as a way to help Hoosiers. This is all about a gentleman that's in the White House in Washington, D.C. We're going to disenfranchise, and especially minority voters. When you look at Representative Mervan and Representative Carson's district, you have heavy minority voters in those two districts. And we're disenfranchising voters as a whole. And then a little bit related to the first point I made is we're going to come back not to do anything to help Hoosiers with issues that are facing them. And we're going to cost Hoosiers some unknown amount of money by, number one, the fact of us coming back into special session, which will cost money. And number two, I don't know what it costs, but for redistricting to happen, that's going to be a cost factor as well. If we do go back in and it does get voted across.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like their eye is just on preserving their own power. It's not on helping Hoosier families, prosper and do better and solve their actual problems. And, that's why they have to resort to this unusual, non-democratic process because, what has the president done, right? Theoretically, he was elected because people were mad that things are just too expensive. Eggs are too expensive. I don't think I'm going to be able to retire with dignity. I don't think I will ever be able to afford a home. I'm working my ass off and I'm not earning enough to have a reasonable quality of life. I think that because of that, people said, you know what, we're just going to try something else again because we don't think the people who have been in power are getting the job done, focused on who is president. And yet, what does President Trump do when he gets in office? He starts playing around, again, in a way never intended with tariffs, right, which are basically import taxes. So taxing things coming into our country used to be a job of Congress. Right. But Congress said, well, if we're in an emergency or we're in a war, there's some, major thing happening. OK, president, you can have some authority. President Trump completely stretches that beyond, where it really should be. And he increases prices on all kinds of products that people buy. People going to Walmart are going to see all kinds of higher prices because of what he did. Then he turns around, he passes this, ugly bill, whatever he wants to call it, and he cuts people off of health care. Right? Millions of people are not going to have health care because of that. And he's literally taking food out of the mouths of kids by messing with the SNAP program. And then he dumps a bunch more costs on the states, which makes it even more likely there's going to be a second whammo, for people who are struggling because the states are probably going to throw their hands up and say, like, well, we can't do this program anymore. We're just going to have to cut, other things to pick up the slack from the feds. And so everything that they're doing out there is undermining the prosperity, the goal of prosperity for working families right here in Indiana. And that's their biggest problem. They just, if they would learn how to focus back on to what's actually going to help people, maybe they'd have a chance. But instead, they're just into power for power's sake, and they don't respect any of the you talk about George Washington. I mean, what was the genius of our Constitution and our system of government? It was like 3 separate but equal branches of government. Power spread out so no one person had dictatorial powers. Checks and balances, right? If every branch of government is doing its job, it will check the excesses of one or the other. And there's supposed to be this kind of struggle to adopt policies, right? You have to win the day. And now we've devolved to a situation where we have some guy with orange hair gets on, his True Social site and he pronounces a policy. And that's it. No debate, no chance for the public to have any input on it. And that's not how our democracy is supposed to work. And I'm really hoping that in this coming election, people who have been sitting on the sidelines in a lot of these elections saying, who's it matter who actually runs this place? Nothing much ever happens that helps me. So heck with it all. They've got to get tuned in because if we don't have a very strong pushback coming up in this midterm election and these Republicans don't feel some pain at the ballot box, they're going to say, oh, America is just fine with what we're doing. Let's keep going. Let's put more military in the streets in our cities across the nation. Let's be ready to do whatever it takes for us to continue in power, even if we don't deserve it.
Matt, this all feels pretty bleak at the moment. So, what should people be doing right now, right? So obviously we've indicated that we're putting up a fight. We are trying to, I think we're all working the folks on the other side that we have close relationships with to like plead with them to make the right decision, to do the right thing. But what can the average person who's just driving to work right now listening to this, what can they do?
Well, I do think that contacting your elected officials can have some impact. I mean, if the governor really gets swamped with people, and, particularly if there are Republicans out there, who believe in the rules, who believe in democratic principles, particularly if they're hearing from people in their own base of support, like, look, this is, I'm as a Republican, I'm embarrassed that you're even talking about this. I think that can have an impact. So definitely, doing the outreach, the calling, participating in the process, democratic process, that's important in the short term. But I think what really is the most important in the long term is people have to be engaged in the political process. You cannot be a bystander, right? And so that might be sending $5 to the candidate you support. That might be going out and knocking on some doors, putting up a yard sign, doing these kinds of things that candidates have to do. You need to get involved and get behind candidates that you think will support, your family, will adopt policies that are going to help you prosper. And in Indiana, we have maybe half the people vote. And so if we just had 10 or 15% of the people who've been sitting out these elections getting involved, getting activated, you could revolutionize the whole political landscape in Indiana. And so, people who are frustrated and they're tired of feeling like there's nothing we can do, well, there's a lot we can do. And it's focused on November of 2026. And so, you've got to get your family members, your neighbors, you got to make them understand why it's important to get involved at a minimum vote. But even better, decide which candidates you think will be best for our futures and get out there and work for them. Knock on doors, help them get the mail out the door, do whatever needs to be done to win these elections. And that's, I'm telling you, if we have a good midterm election and the Republicans feel the pain, that's going to put a big dent. First, we'll have checks and balances back again, which would be a good thing. And a lot of Republicans are going to be thinking to themselves, man, we followed this Trump guy and we got a whooping when we did. And so we've got to change our direction. And maybe we can get back to an old Republican Party that would argue about taxes and regulation and, some of the other issues that we're used to Republicans pushing, and not taking us off on these crazy made up issues that President Trump comes up with.
Yeah, that's so true, because we're state representatives in Indiana. We are elected to represent 68,000 people and to do what's right and to make their lives better. We were not put in office to help somebody keep power that's in Washington, D.C. And so I hope people understand, and those that aren't engaged, get engaged and realize that your vote is your voice and that it means something in terms of not only how this state will function, but also how the country will function.
Absolutely. The people have the power. And the problem is, I think a lot of people don't believe it anymore. They've been disappointed. They don't feel like they can really impact the system. But, I just think back over the years, people who had no political power, women didn't have the right to vote. And it took them decades and decades. It took too long, but they kept at it. By 1920, they were able to, get the right to vote. African Americans in the South, in a system of apartheid, zero political power. And they just kept pushing and pushing. And by 1964, we get the Voting Rights Act and other legislation that gives them political power. And so for those of us who already have political power, we just maybe are choosing not to exercise it, we can make things happen. I'm convinced, but it has to become a movement, right? It has to be everyone saying like, whoa, our democracy is in trouble. We got to ring the alarm bells. We all got to get out there. This is more than about which party's running Congress. This is about who will respect the norms of our democracy, who will restore the guiding principles of our nation and follow that. And I think that that's worth getting out and fighting for in the next election.
Well, Matt, that is the time we've got. I think if someone was listening this morning on this episode, they've had to drive around the block a few times to keep going. So we're gonna end it there. Thanks for joining us. And you heard it from Matt, from Earl. Please contact your legislators, contact the governor's office. Let them know that you are among the 80% of people who believe that this process should be fair and balanced and not focused on serving one individual who's renovating the mansion in DC. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks you guys for being a part of the conversation. And I'm sure we'll have an update for everybody soon.